Folks, I would like to complete what we started 6 months ago. I was hoping to have this all completed before the end of December. But the last one I wanted to do, I was having great personal wrestles over because of the conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians and the war that was going on, because this one is a bit personal in that particular area. But with the war now over, and we hope it'll stay over, I felt just a little more comfortable in sharing this with you. And so what I'd like to do is just remind you that we went on a series of following the footsteps of Jesus around while we were studying Mark and John. And today we come to the last topic, and it's called The Temple Mount Just Muddies the Water Further. How does the Temple Mount muddy the waters further? Well, in a single explanation now, it's the conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Muslim forces there in Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount is still a very, very controversial area. So let's have a look and share this together. And now look, you will recognise that in our, I think it was the second session that we did before, we actually did go to the Temple Mount to look at the temple itself and how Jesus connected with that. We're not looking at that part of it today. We're looking at what you see there as you go. So go to Jerusalem and you're going to a walled city. The old city is still very much walled. Some of those walls have been built in more recent times. In fact, some of them were not even in existence in that particular area in Jesus' time, as you'll see from a map later on. There are 7 accessible gates around the city walls. Some of those gates are the same as they were in biblical times, such as the Golden Gate, but you'll notice it's all been sealed up because the Jewish belief is they will be open when the Messiah comes and he'll be the first to go through. So the gates remain closed at this stage from the Jewish perspective onto the Temple Mount. The dung gates have been moved from where they were in Jesus' time. And they're now much closer to the actual the Temple Mount actually than what they used to be. In fact, it's through these dung gates that we were making our entrance in and out, going to the Wailing Wall, as you'll see in a moment. You will notice also by the photographs that around the gates is well pitted from bullets hitting there from one of the many conflicts that they've faced. And this has been one area where they haven't repaired, but just like to leave it there as exhibit number 1 as you enter the city. Herod's Gate, again, a new gate since the time of Jesus, even though it is named after a character in Jesus' time, but it was a Christian era that where it was a little stronger in Jerusalem, that they managed to have this gate opened as well. Then there's the Lion Gate. This is a gate that's been put in by the Islam people over the years, and you can see the lions up the top there will actually be an indication of that connection. The Damascus Gate is another one. It's probably the biggest gate where most people go in and out of the old city. It really is a very impressive gate. And it's put into a wall that's only about 500 years old. It wasn't there again in Jesus' time, but it's a new wall that's gone right up to the north, and it opens up and heads, if you're going straight north, to Damascus. That's why it's called the Damascus Gate. So they're just some of the gates as you go around the city. Oh, and the Jaffa Gate and the Tower of David, which you can just see in the bottom picture, it's sticking up there and enlarged a little bit more. In fact, again, the Tower of David has nothing to do with the city of David. David never lived here. The person who lived here was Herod. This is where he had his palace. So it's interesting to follow the names and the histories that go with it. Now we're inside the walled city, and we are probably at the best known wall in Jerusalem. Possibly you've always known it as the Wailing Wall, or it's more politically correctly called the Western Wall, because this is the temple. This is the wall of the Temple Mount that was in existence in Jesus' day, and he would have seen this wall. Obviously, there have been reconstructions and extensions of this wall over time, but it was there in Jesus' day. And in fact, the bottom stones of the wall were there in Solomon's day. And that's why it is, now that the Jews are not able to worship anywhere on the Temple Mount above, it's all Muslim Islamic territory today, This is their most sacred site, the Western Wall. This is where they gather to do their worship, and you'll see in a little bit later on just how dedicated they are about their worship there as well. All right, now I'll go to, which we've got the most side to go to. All right, I'll go to this side here for a minute. Over here we have, you can see if I can get this going. No, doesn't want to, oh, just saw it. No, it's not good enough to keep pressing. All right, you can see where the walled city comes around the actual side of the Temple Mount, along, down, out, and then the rest of this wall going around here is just a part of the wall of the old city. And it goes well up. I wish I could point to it, but it's about, if it goes straight up in line with the Temple Mount up to the top, and then it curls across and goes around and comes around. It's quite an area where the old temple exists. But the area that's of most interest to us is this area that you see raised in the middle. It's on the high point of the city at this stage. And you can see the walls that go around, and you can see there are two Islamic, one's a mosque and one's a shrine. And it's those that we're going to be having a look at in just a moment. So what's the history? What's the story behind here? Well, again, I'll come over, and I was expecting to get a button on this, but it's not working. First of all, the grey area that you see up there and coming around here is what you see when you go to Jerusalem today. That's where the walls are. In Jesus' time, it came down to here, all right, and went across the top down there. But what we're particularly interested in, the first thing we know about Jerusalem is really David, who captures Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and this was called the City of David. And it was a walled city that he constructed there, or was responsible for constructing. And then after his time, Solomon comes along, and the green, which goes up to include the Temple Mount as well, was the additional walled part of the city that Solomon extends. And then, of course, after his time, Hezekiah wanted to include the water coming from the Gihon spring and coming down through the Hezekiah's tunnel and coming out here to the Pool of Siloam. He wanted to include that inside the wall, and this is Hezekiah's wall that goes up through there. So it's amazing just, you know, how much the city kept being extended from time to time. And so we're starting off, first of all, with David, who has a vision for the temple of God. But God says, no, you can't make it. You're a man of blood. You'll just have to sit back. We'll give it to your son. So Solomon gets the responsibility of really building it is a phenomenal piece of land there in Israel. All right, so here it is. You can still see again the Western or Wailing Wall is what is down here in the shadow this way. And by the way, this is a good picture to show you, right into the corner of the Wailing Wall there. It does continue right along, but those buildings were never there in Jesus' time, for example. They were never there when Solomon built the temple originally and put the wall around it. And so you can go in there, and I will go in there with Graham Bradford with you in a little bit, and we'll find that if you can go right along till you exactly at a right angle to where the most holy place would have been in the Solomon's temple. That's the most sacred part of the wall. And not everybody gets to it, but Graham Bradford knew how to get there, and he took me with me, so I thought that was good. Okay, so here we've got Abraham. You remember the story, how God says to Abraham, Abraham, go and sacrifice your son Isaac. And I want you to sacrifice in the region of Moriah he's sent to, and on one of the mountains there that I tell you, that's where you make the sacrifice. All right? In 2 Chronicles 3, it says that Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. It is believed that the same place where Abraham sacrificed his son, or was prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac on the rock there on Mount Moriah, was the same place where Solomon built the temple. So what you are looking at, going back to the I've gone to the next step, it's kind of covered it up, but the next step is, after the Abrahamic story, is in the 10th century, that's when Solomon builds his temple. So I've popped a little golden temple over the top there, just to say probably somewhere in that vicinity there was where the Temple of Solomon was built, and it was on the top of Mount Moriah. And of course, then the whole platform around was built up and filled up, and the walls, of course, were put in by Solomon, etc. All right. After that, in the early 6th century, Nebuchadnezzar comes along and he destroys what's called the first temple. And then, about 70 years later, you remember how the exiles left Babylon. And at the end of the 6th century, Zerubbabel was the one who was responsible for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And remember how the people complained, oh, this temple is not as good. This is those who could remember the former temple and its glory of Solomon's temple. This is not as good as Solomon's temple. And Malachi, the prophet, had to come along and remind them, but hey, in this temple would walk the presence of God, referring to Jesus would be the one who would be walking through what's now known as the Second Temple. All right, so that was done in the 6th century BC. And then, of course, it even started a little bit before the 1st century, but Herod, who comes into our biblical story in the New Testament, one of his many building projects was refurbishing the temple in Jerusalem. And so what you see now as the temple again sitting over that site, it's not a rebuilt sanctuary, but it is refurbished and it is made into magnificent display. The pride of the disciples, for example, up there on the mountain, looking down, this is on Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley up to the Temple Mount and seeing the temple glowing in the sun. And they were proud of that, and they came to express it so with Jesus. But he told them, look, there's going to be a day when not one stone will be left upon another. And that day came in AD 70. Titus is the one who breaks into the walls, through the walls, and he destroys the temple. Against his instructions, the temple was burnt down. He asked them to preserve it because even Titus recognised it was one of the great wonders of the world almost. Don't burn the temple. But somebody in their excitement did. And so the whole temple was lost, and every stone at the foundation of that temple was turned over looking for the melted gold that had gone down between the cracks of the foundation stones. Not one stone be left upon another. That's the point where the Jewish connection with the Temple Mount finished. They were exiled at that stage out of Rome. There was what was called a second revolt in the 2nd century. And not only were they now exiled, but they were banned from coming into Jerusalem completely. And so the Jews suddenly lost a whole history here, and obviously they lost the possession of the Temple Mount. In a moment, I'll show you what actually happens, but I want to now take you to the Temple Mount and say, well, okay, eventually the Islamic people take control of it, and they build the mosque and the Dome of the Rock there. Now, again, just putting ourselves back into perspective, this is sunset, by the way, Friday night opening Sabbath at the Western Wall. Everybody comes in for that, and it was quite exciting to see that all taking place. But up the top, is where you've got the actual Temple Mount. And now, so that I get through this, I put this on automatic for a few while I quickly talk about, here are the Jews at the Western Wall worshipping. One of the incredible things that they do, apart from praying, is they will be reading the scriptures, writing prayers and putting them on paper in the cracks of the stones. And it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a rabbi, you can be a military person. We all come in as good Zionists and good supporters of the Jewish cause. Children as well, they're all there. Notice this man has a little box on his head called a phylactery. This one coming up in a moment, you'll see, has one on his arms and straps tied around so that it's closest to his heart, because in the book of Deuteronomy it says, bind to your heart and mind the law. And those verses that are outlined there are put into those little boxes when they go to worship. This is now underneath the buildings I was pointing out to you before, still walking along the face of the Western Wall. And there's Graham Bradford. He's taking us in. and were able to actually see this fairly unusual part. Very few people get access here. In fact, the two girls that you saw there, one sitting, one standing, they are directly 90 degrees facing towards, they couldn't get any closer by touching the wall at that point to where the most holy place was in Solomon's temple, or in the second temple for that matter. All right, so let's now actually go and have a look on the Temple Mount. You'll see that there are two buildings here of interest to us. One is what's known as the Dome of the Rock, and the rock becomes fairly significant in a moment. The other is a worshipping mosque, the Mosque of Alaska. That's where, for example, on Friday, I was caught in a church rush, if you like, or a Muslim rush. We'd just come in through the gate, and the Muslim people were filing through just in a mob that you couldn't stand still and hold your ground. You just were pushed along with this mob, and they were going down to this mosque for worship. But the other one is the Dome of the Rock, and this one is not actually a mosque, it's a shrine. And the date for when it was built was the 7th century, the end of the 7th century. Now, hang on to that date, if you will, because it becomes important. By the way, this is not the first Dome of the Rock that was built there. It has been rebuilt twice. And obviously, it's kept up now to look a very attractive piece with a gold leaf painting over the top of the dome and the tiles, etc. When you see them, yeah, it's an attractive sight. It's the attraction in Jerusalem now for the general public to go and see the Dome of the Rock. And you can see the tiles and the beauty that's had there as well. When you go inside, you've got to take your shoes off, and the carpet smells a bit footy, but it's interesting. And then you go in and you walk around the centrepiece, and you can look down on the centrepiece, and there is a rock. All right? Now, this is the rock that is believed when it says that Solomon built the temple on Mount Moriah, and Abraham sacrificed his son, or was prepared to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah. This was the rock where that took place, so the tradition says. And for that reason, you can imagine how sacred this is to the Jewish people. All right? But let me, just by looking here at another one, notice, by the way, on the side picture, notice the stairs going down, because the rock has a hole drilled through it. You can see the light coming out. This actually is a safe place for women to just go and have small worship. All right? Maybe, their husbands might be over at the Alaska mosque, but they can come in here, and it's solely for women to be able to worship there in the cave under that rock. All right? So it's become extremely important to the Islamic people as well. Now, perhaps I'll just go back for a minute before I come to that. One of the reasons why it's very important to the Islamic people is because they believe that this rock was the rock where Abraham was instructed by God to sacrifice Ishmael. Read it in the Quran. It's there, all right? That it was Ishmael that God told to go and sacrifice in the circumstances. And so you can now imagine, here's two people, or three if you like, if you place the Christians in it as well. On one side you've got the Islamic world, full of faith and belief that this is the rock where Abraham was told to sacrifice their forefather, because remember, Ishmael is seen as the forefather of the Arab races of the world, which is basically the Islamic world today. And so they treat this with great regard, but it has another value to them as well. Muhammad came here and he ascended back to heaven, according to the Islamic tradition, after standing on this rock. This is where Muhammad ascended. So can you see why this site where the Islamic people now have a shrine to their history, and such a rich history as well, as the Jews have a rich history to it as well, as being the Solomon's temple site, being the Abraham site for Isaac, etc. Can you see why there is so much tension over this particular site between Jews and Islam people today? Yes, there has been a little bit of a compromise and there's been some discussion, but Every time I've been to Jerusalem, I don't see any further evidence of it actually happening, that the Muslim people are going to sacrifice a part of the Temple Mount further to the north. They're going to sacrifice a part of that and let them build a temple up there. The Jewish people build a temple, but so far it's not happening, and I don't know the politics for that at all. You can go and buy a Hard Rock or a Holy Rock t-shirt, if you like, down the street to just commemorate this great visit. Now, here's what I want to show you, which just muddies the water about who's got the right site and who has the right to it. Let's look at the story very quickly. First century was when pagan Rome controlled Palestine. All right? Goes way back. I've only done it from the beginning of the first century, but of course this goes back, and then the Greeks controlled it, and then, the Babylonians, and so it goes. But we're looking here from the time of Jesus. You've got the Roman world controls it until AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and of course the Jews now have to move away from their sacred site. And then we've got, once we get to the 4th century, and by the way, I've only put the beginning dates here in almost every situation, and basically they continue to flow on until the next date, even though there's quite a bit of overlap in some cases. In the 4th century, we have what's known as the Byzantine era, when, and remember that Byzantine was just simply when Constantine, the Roman emperor, in AD 30, he took the pagan Roman throne from Rome over to Constantinople, and that's why it gets the new name now. It comes from Constantine, and that's where the rest of the emperors who ruled in the Roman Empire, that's where they ruled from, Constantinople. But by this time, one of the other things that Constantine is, he is the first emperor to become Christian. And so now when we start talking about the Byzantine era, this actually is a Christian period during this time, a strong Christian period throughout Europe and the Middle East, including Israel. But sadly, the Christians weren't much more generous to the Jewish people and what they would like to have done at that point in time than what the Islamic people are going to do when they come along, and they're the next part of our story. Because it's in the beginning of the 7th century, 610 AD, that Muhammad begins his journey or his conversion. No, I'm not quite sure what you'd call it, but he began the Islamic faith in 610 and began to spread it. From Saudi Arabia was where he came from, and very quickly, within a century, almost the entire Middle East was just because of the Arab influence right across the Middle East. The Islamic faith just moved very quickly right throughout the Middle East world at that particular time. Now, this would have included Jerusalem, of course. And so we find that by the end of that 7th century, the Dome of the Rock is built. How quickly things moved. And so this is where the beginning of that sacred time came. Now, the Crusaders, give them their credit, they thought, well, look, we've got to bring the fold back again, all this Islam influence coming right across the Christian world. And so they set out in their crusades, and they did a lot of control, and it benefited at some stages. It benefited the Jewish cause in Jerusalem, etc., other times not. But for a couple of centuries, they continued to be partly and partially in control, still with Arabic forces and other Islamic people. Then you got in the 13th century, for about another 3 or 4 centuries here, there were a list of dynasties and families from Arabic background that continued to control Jerusalem, and obviously Islamic. All right? So can you see, and by the way, so was the 16th century when the Ottoman Turks, began their rule right up to, and came to an end at World War I. They too were strongly Islamic. And so we now have, if you have a look at this, basically from up there in the 7th century, right down till we get to the 20th century, we get Islamic influence and control of Jerusalem, and the Jews having different at different times, different access and a measure of support or opposition. It's a very complicated story, but you can get the general gist of what I am saying. The Jews in the Old Testament claimed this Temple Mount is theirs. God sent Abraham there. He sent Solomon there. The temple stood there right up past the time of Jesus. So we could sort of add up the years there and say, well, from Solomon's time, about 1,000 years altogether. The Jews held control of the Temple Mount. But now look, the Islamic people have held control of the Temple Mount right up until, and you notice there the last two indications are at World War I, when the British mandate, and this came about, again, quite complicated, but in a nutshell, if I can just summarise this so I can bring it to a close. It would be the 19th century, there was the rise of Zionism. Now, a few of these Jewish people who were supporting the Zionist cause, you know, Israel to come back to Mount Zion and to Jerusalem and to be a great nation of people again. Some of them lived in Palestine, but not many. More of them probably lived in New York, in other parts of the world, Russia. And it's incredible. There were big pockets of Jewish people right across the world. And their growing movement was coming up that we must go back and possess our promised land and take possession of the Temple Mount and build another temple. All right? This was all a part of the Zionist doctrine. And as a result of that, when we came to World War I, and of course now with the bringing of the rewards, etc., and handing them out at the end of World War I, the British were put in charge of Palestine. When we get to the Second World War, because the Jews were treated so poorly during the Second World War with the Holocaust, they decided that it was time to have no longer a British mandate, but that the state of Israel now be re-established with occupied Palestinian territories, Arab territories, Muslim people. And that's why we have this ongoing conflict and tension there today. It's simply because we have two groups of people who both believe in their minds that they have a right to this sacred site and that they have a right to worship here and that the others don't. One has a right that says we were here first. The other has a right that says, well, we were here for a little bit longer, actually, but later. And so you've got two groups of people just struggling and wrestling with this. And the tensions that we are seeing and the war, for example, in Gaza, all this is a part of what plays into the tension that exists between those two races of people and two religious races of people. And I think you can see how we're not providing a solution to it at all. That's a very difficult thing to do, but I think you can probably see what was actually happening there and how it is that this is something that we need to be understanding of, and we need to certainly be understanding of both the Jewish people and their cause, but also the Palestinian, the Arab, the Muslim people and their cause. I think the greatest thing that we can take away from this story is that in Genesis 22, Isaac says to his father, "Where's the lamb?" And Abraham says, God himself will provide the lamb. And you know the story, how that when the angel came to Abraham and pointed out there was a ram caught in the thicket, and that ram was sacrificed. Abraham says, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And let me assure you that the Lord has provided at Jehovah Jireh, at Calvary. And when he died as the Lamb of God there, that's the salvation for the world. And that's our mission. So let us remember that as we continue to be committed to sharing this gospel with the world so that one day soon Jesus can come.